Hello, Advanced Anatomy and Physiology crew. Just some midweek reminders. This week we are doing the autonomic nervous system for lecture, and we are finishing up the blood vessels and doing portal systems for lab. And it might be better to take a look at this after you've studied a little bit, but I'd like to just give you a few reminders. This is sort of how I think about the autonomic nervous system. Your central nervous system consists of your brain and your spinal cord, and then you've got peripheral nerves that run from your spinal cord and carry information out, and you've got nerves that run from your brain and carry information out. When we're talking about the peripheral nervous system, there are really two big ways to think about the motor control. Your brain and your spinal cord control muscles. If the voluntary muscles, like your skeletal muscles, are the ones that are being controlled, then the information always goes out on somatic pathways. And whether they start in the brain or the spinal cord, somatic pathways always rely on only one neuron to carry information down and out to some skeletal muscles. And we did this quite a bit last semester when we were talking about neuromuscular junction and ACH being released and T-tubules, etc. The autonomic nervous system is the system that controls involuntary tissues. For example, like your bronchioles, or for example, like your heart. And I know that's not a great picture. Or for example, like your stomach. In order to carry information, motor information out to involuntary tissues, the autonomic pathways always utilize two neurons. The first neuron will synapse with a cluster of cell bodies called a ganglion, and the second neuron will always take information directly to the tissue that we're trying to talk about. So the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system are the two functional subdivisions of the autonomic nervous system. And they both operate at the same time. So all of these potential target tissues will receive information from both systems simultaneously. That's called dual innervation. And we can go through these systems in order. I think this is how the PowerPoint does. The sympathetic nervous system is the division that prepares your tissues for action. And you have to be careful when you think about that. The sympathetic nervous system does not speed everything up. The sympathetic nervous system will prepare the tissues that help you become more physical for action, and they will shut down the tissues that you don't need in emergency or dangerous situations. Sympathetic impulses always arise from either the thoracic or the lumbar region of the spinal cord. So if you're ever taking a look at a diagram, and if you're ever talking about the autonomic nervous system, and the cell body for outgoing information is either in the thoracic or the lumbar region, you automatically know you're talking about the sympathetic nervous system. In the sympathetic nervous system, because we always use two neurons, the preganglionic neuron in sympathetic pathways is always relatively short, which would mean the postganglionic neuron in that pathway would have to be relatively long to make up the difference. The first neurotransmitter that's released at these two sites will be ACH, which makes this presynaptic neuron and this presynaptic neuron cholinergic. On the postganglionic neurons, right here at this synapse and at this synapse, there are cholinergic receptors that bind to ACH. The postganglionic neurons, in both of these cases, will release norepinephrine at these two synapses down here, which will make both postganglionic neurons adrenergic, and that will also mean that on the target tissues, we'll have adrenergic receptors. If a pathway starts in the brain or the sacral region of the spinal cord, you automatically should know, after you've studied this, that we're talking about a parasympathetic pathway. Parasympathetic preganglionic neurons are always relatively long, and they synapse with postganglionic neurons that are relatively short and usually found almost right at the target tissue. As with the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neurons in parasympathetic pathways release ACH, which makes parasympathetic preganglionic neurons cholinergic, and it just so happens that the final neurotransmitter in parasympathetic pathways is also ACH. So not only is the postganglionic short neuron cholinergic, the receptors on the target tissue are also cholinergic. So it's a good idea just to memorize the anatomy. There's always two neurons, preganglionic neuron and a postganglionic neuron. In the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron will arise in the thoracic or the lumbar region. The first neurotransmitter will always be ACH, and then the long postganglionic neuron will release norepinephrine onto adrenergic receptors. For the parasympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron will always be found either in the brain or the spinal cord. The preganglionic parasympathetic neuron is always long, and the postganglionic neuron is always short. And with the parasympathetic nervous system, both sites use ACH, so they're only cholinergic axons and receptors. So if you take a look at this, we can think about dual innervation. Your heart is dually innervated by both systems. Your stomach is dually innervated by both systems. Depending upon what your body needs at any given moment, one of these systems will be in primary control. In general, if it's a structure that will help you become a better physical machine, the sympathetic nervous system would increase function using stimulatory receptors. If the parasympathetic nervous system were in charge, for example, when you're sleeping on the heart, the parasympathetic nervous system uses inhibitory receptors to slow the function down. Conversely, if you're running for your life from a jaguar, you probably don't need to digest the fish sandwich that you just ate. The sympathetic nervous system would use norepinephrine to slow down or decrease stomach functions because they're not important at that moment. Meanwhile, when you're sleeping or resting, the parasympathetic nervous system would use stimulatory receptors to increase the functions. So if you want to think about this a little bit, it helps me to draw a picture like this. Now, there are some things that are a little bit goofy. Pupils and bronchioles will be an example. Remember, the smooth muscle in your bronchioles or in your pupils can be stimulated or inhibited. Stimulatory neurons decrease the size of tubes, or stimulatory receptors increase smooth muscle contraction and cause constriction. Inhibitory receptors on smooth muscle cause vasodilation. So this is kind of a good one. So if we were thinking about your bronchioles right here, which remember are the tubes that carry air to your lungs, if you were in an emergency situation, would the sympathetic nervous system, let's say you're running from a jaguar, you're in a flight or fight response, would the sympathetic nervous system have stimulatory or inhibitory receptors on bronchioles? And this is the good question. If you're running or if you're in an emergency situation, it would be advantageous to have your bronchioles dilate, to get bigger, to carry more air. And in order to do that, the sympathetic nervous system would use norepinephrine, and those receptors would be inhibitory to allow for bronchodilation. All right, if this helps, awesome. If this is just more confusing, then you can just forget about this. But I like to think about this as a diagram. I like to know that the pathways exist with pre- and postganglionic neurons. You have to memorize the receptors and the neurotransmitters, but then you also really have to think about target tissues. And are those receptors going to increase function or constrict tubes, or are those receptors going to decrease functions or relax and cause dilation of tubes?